So our first speaker is Karen Pinto, who is assistant professor of history at Boise State University, and she will be speaking on MIME. Is it MIME or M-I-M-E?
Mime.
MIME, and other digital experimentations with Islamic maps.
Thank you. So we're very happy that we found a CD drive to run this, because apparently this is now old technology, and we were talking about how technology changes in our world very quickly, and we were able to do that. So I actually have a website that I house this on, but a bunch of the modules have stopped working, and I just discovered that although I recently paid to renew the website, for some reason it's not coming up. So very good thing the CD is working. So in keeping with some of the discussions here, first of all, some of you know my work. If you don't know my work, you know that I'm a crazy maps person. I spend all my time reading maps. So I'm very happy to be part of this distant reading group, and to see that maps can be accepted as needing to be read, images as text, which is how I work with them. And for those of you who are into manuscripts here, you're going to get quite a manuscript treat as well. So over the course of my work, my research, I collected something like 3,000 map images, many that have never been published before, that I managed to convince the libraries that I worked with to let me photograph, a whole other story, how I managed to do that. And when you collect that many images, you have the problem of how to deal with them, how to catalog them, how to make them accessible, all of those things. So 8 years ago now, I think. Is that correct? Is that what 2006 puts us in? Or is it 9 years ago? I started an actual, what happened? Okay, there we go. I started a project at the American University of Beirut. Lebanon is a great place for emerging technologies and great ideas. I worked with some amazing programmers. And what I'm going to show you now, which hasn't really developed since then because I haven't had the kind of programming access or the money. At that time, the then provost of AUB, Peter Heath, who unfortunately passed away last year, and so in a way this could be dedicated to his memory. He was a very supportive person, and he helped get me the initial funds to get this started and off the ground. And so we very excitedly, I found a programmer I like to work with, very original person who's now in Australia. I told him this is going to be live cast and he might want to watch it from Australia. Someone by the name of Hussein Naeem. And we settled down and we started working on it in July 2006, early July 2006. This might ring some bells for you. July 2006, Lebanon. We worked on it for about 5 days and got off the ground, and then the bombs started falling. So there's a story behind this, and I think it's important to share that story. As I found out from living in Lebanon, it's the battlefield, one of the major battlefields in the Middle East, and Israel likes to harass Lebanon quite a bit. And then sometimes it actually escalates to war and the bombs fall. So we were 5 days into this project, and the Israeli-Lebanon war started. Fortunately, we had some material already shared. I had shared it with my programmer. He evacuated to Saudi Arabia. I evacuated to southeastern Turkey, a tiny little village near Iskenderun called Gözcüler, which you've probably never heard of in your life. They had no internet. I had to bike an hour away to get to an internet place that mostly was about playing foosball, and had the slowest connection in the world. And somehow through texting and working through this really slow connection, we got this project started. Now, it didn't reach the culmination point we would have ideally hoped it to reach, but we had limitations. Most of us didn't get back together for a year later because everybody got scattered and then depressed after the war, et cetera, things that happen in Lebanon on a regular basis. And so what I'm going to show you, and then I came to the US after that, and I had no funding. I couldn't find the funding to continue this thing. And of course, being an assistant professor, for which I might have a record very soon, like not holding an American passport after all the years of being here, I was so busy publishing and writing, I wasn't able to get back to my digital project. And then I saw Elias's wonderful, I used to watch these digital humanities, his webcasts, and think, whoa, this is so wonderful, I really need to go. And so the opportunity arose, I applied, and here I am, and I decided I'm going to share this even though I haven't been able to do anything more with it. I'm still at the point where not just funding to further it, but funding to even share the images is not in place. So you're the only ones who are seeing this. They are not going to be recording this on the webcast because we had a chat, the people at the back and I, and decided that I didn't want to get into the trouble with the libraries that might arise if they were to say to me, how dare you shared our images without officially paying all the permission costs that you should have. And that's one of the limitations I've had. So I have this website, but it's private, it's passworded. And so part of why I'm here today is to say, you know, this is what I have. I'm looking for ways of furthering this in the future, ideas, anything. There's got so much potential, but I've been stuck by funding issues. Okay. So we start off, and as you said, you know, we put this on, and we've got a little pre-screen that requires you to promise not to do anything bad, otherwise, you know, we could come after you and all those. We tried to put some things like that in to make sure that we wouldn't get into trouble. And the way we set it up, and you know, you're going to see this now, of course, there's so many different things going, and we've been seeing this today, and yet this was Hossein Naim's conception of how to do this. Some of these things he has digitally gone dot by dot to digitize and so that he could keep the quality really high. Just amazing stuff. So we have what we started off with. We wanted to do sort of an interactive map. At the time, I was working on my Mediterranean project, which I'm working on now. I'm finishing another book, and this is going to be, hopefully, if I can get the funding, the digital end of it. So we decided to focus on the Mediterranean map for the analysis. But the idea was that this would be the case for all the maps. I guess I should sort of give you a little pre-information. This is all coming from a manuscript series called the Kitab al-Masalik wal-Mamalik, Book of Roots and Kingdoms, or Roots and Realms, as is also being translated as. And not all of these are illustrated. I'm dealing with the cartographically illustrated manuscripts. There are 21 maps in every copy. This is the world map, and then there's various regional maps of the seas in certain districts, etc. So we decided to start with the Mediterranean map, and one of the things that I do, you know, is a big part of my work is place analysis, identification, and analysis. So we thought, well, if we were thinking about how we would want to share this with the general public, say a public that doesn't necessarily read Arabic, that would want to be able to know what's going on in this map. So we plugged in a few things. Now, one of the things we did, of course, was just a straight, I've done this, just a straight map translation of the places, right? And the idea is, oh, it doesn't show on that, but the idea is that this is an interactive map so that you could actually roll over, right, and get labels that tell you what's going on. So, and you can actually go to spots, sites, rivers, and, you know, and I'm actually, this is a very interesting section. This is the frontier section here, but, or maybe I should do it here. This is the frontier section between the Islamic and Byzantine worlds, right? The famous Thagur, it's a fascinating part of this map. But then, of course, it faces west. Opposite is the Bosphorus and the Nile, the delta. That's all that's shown on the Mediterranean maps. You'll have Egyptian maps that will show the rest of Egypt. We have maps of Syria. We have maps of North Africa, or Maghreb. I've written on some of these, so if you go to my academia.edu site, if you haven't seen my articles, you can drop some down. And then, of course, the mythical island of Jabal al-Kilal, which caps the mouth of the Mediterranean. So we made this interactive. That was the first thing we did. And then if we go back, to the interactive map, we also plugged in a information panel section. And the idea, and again, we got some of this done, and then as I said, we had our limitations. He went his way, I came to the US. We could only do so much, but these things that have red balls, these are the ones that are complete. So if you scroll over this list, you can actually, an arrow pops up and you can see the site, and then if you click it, okay, let me see if I can find the one that actually, okay, it's the Algarve. If you click it, the idea is, so there's the Algarve, it's being highlighted there by the red dot. It's in what is present-day Portugal on the coast, and the idea was that I wanted to give both the modern name for it, the Arabic transliterated name for it, and then the name in Arabic as well. So that's what we adopted as a convention, and you could then, I'd do the writing on it, and then you could read up on the town, and so on. And we've got a number of places, but we weren't able to fully complete this. So. And then the other thing that we wanted to do was to create a situation where you could actually go in. So we go back to the main map there, and you can go in and actually go and magnify sections of the image. It's just, my programmer was brilliant. But eventually I couldn't pay him, so he had to get a regular job, and he couldn't be working with my project anymore. But you could actually go in and see some of the image up close, look at the illumination, etc. So, and then we also wanted to try to compare it to a modern map, and we went one step further, and this is something I'm writing about in my book. We decided to actually put those places on the modern map so that you could see. So when we see this map of the Mediterranean, of course we think, well, it's so stylized, etc. But it does match up, and if we start to put the places on a real map, we start to see the places that this map was focusing on and clustering. So, and it creates another avenue of interpretation. And I think, as I recall, I think we made this interactive. We were trying to anyway, and I think there might be one more iteration which actually points this up on this map so you can see it precisely. And then we even did something called color reference, although I'm not so sure how successful we were in this. It's supposed to give you a number which you can then match with other images. My idea here was, what if, so you were talking about clustering words and picking up word clusters. I was trying to pick up things like the use of the same pigment in other manuscripts. And could we do that? This is much harder, of course. To do it digitally is quite difficult because, does that really correspond? Images when they're photographed in sunlight versus tungsten lights are very different. So I'm not sure if this would have actually worked But it's certainly a nice idea nonetheless. And then we decided that I would like to do a gallery. So, all these wonderful things that one desires. So I put together a gallery of images. So in this case, we focused on the Mediterranean images, right? So just the ability, this one is a Timurid one, for instance. It's the famous peacock and the deer in Anatolia, the same format, of course. This is a Mamluk rendition in Topkapi Sarai. This one is Safavid. These are part of what I've identified as the Ottoman cluster, which I've written on. This is the Maghreb version of the interactive map that I was showing you. I've written on this map as well. And then this is the Maghreb version of the Mamluk map I just showed you. And so on and so forth. So we created a gallery that you could, and the idea was that information on each of these maps would pop up on the side. That's our desideratum. It hasn't quite happened yet. This is the Arabian Peninsula. Here's the Persian Gulf. It's a very famous map of Jonah coming out of the whale. This actually is the one on Egypt that I was telling you about. So in the Mediterranean maps, you only see the Nile Delta. Here you see the whole Nile and a layout of Egypt. This is the Syrian map of Sham. Here's another rendition of it. So let's see, and these are world maps, and my book on medieval Islamic maps and exploration, which is primarily on the world maps, is about to come out with Chicago early next year. So if you're interested in the world maps, you will see a lot of world maps in that context. Here's another world map, usually with south on top. That one was unusual. That's the only one I've ever seen where south is not on top, where actually west is on top, and it's an interesting change. This is what I've identified as an Akkoyunlu rendition. These maps are done, I guess I haven't given you any preliminary information, because that's what I do in my formal talks. They range in time from, the extant copies range in time from the 11th century until the 19th century. So we've got a very broad range. They're emanating out of the original Abbasid Caliphate context, but they get copied all over the place. And so we have Mughal copies, we have Safavid copies, we have Ottoman copies, we have Mamluk copies. Of late, I think I might have identified a very major copy, which I think could even be Sicilian competing with Al-Idrisi. A very interesting format. And I can go into these in question and answer if you want to know more details about these maps, but the purpose of this was to present the digital project. And let's see. The other thing I wanted to do, which I think would be very useful, is to do a comparison. So to be able to say, okay, what if I want to see this Timurid one and compare it with, say, the Mamluk one? So I believe the way it works is I select this, okay, and now, okay, this might, yes, this might, oh, there we go, now we can go to comparison, we've actually selected it. So the idea that I could have the two maps come up side by side, and then we could compare the differences. This is Safavid, that's Timurid, look at the variations in exactly the same map, what happens with the rivers, how these are elongated, these are shortened, what happens as a result of the spatial allocations. Here's Anatolia here, how do these things change? This is the mythical Jabal al-Kilal, this is the rendition here, and then if we went back to something that I've written on, which is the Ottoman cluster maps. Let's see if I can, Med 2, I think. here we go, that's an Ottoman cluster map. And compare the difference, and I've written about this in my article on the Ottoman cluster, so we see a much more elongated Mediterranean as opposed to a rounded one, and that sort of thing. And back to the gallery. And then I also put in here other maps. So they're world maps, they're maps of the Maghreb, and others. And that's why this is called MIME. That was the acronym I came up with. Medieval Islamic Map Encyclopedia. Apparently my time is up. I just quickly show you there's a place for an essay, and I can show you other things. I've also done, this is something I'd written on the Mediterranean map. I've also tried translating this to Google and using a Google map. It hasn't been very successful. That's what they tried at Gettysburg, and they tried to use some Java programming. It just doesn't have the same level of flexibility and interactivity. This is a Flash, based on Flash, and one of the problems with those of you who work on Flash know Flash is constantly updating, and so sometimes the website version doesn't run on all computers, so I've run into that. And what I'm really looking for, I'm going to end now, is I'm looking for feedback, avenues to push this further, takers. I've got some people who are interested in this now, and I thought this would be a wonderful venue to bring it. So, Elias, I won't take any more extra time here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Karen. Very interesting, beautiful images, and very importantly, I note that a Lebanese freelance programmer is more sophisticated than Google, so I will take that and bank it.
Absolutely.
I'm just going to set up for the next speaker. All right, so our next speaker, sorry, I'm just going to pull this out. Okay, so Sayyid Muhammad Baqir Sajadi from Qazvin Islamic Azad University in Iran unfortunately cannot be with us today to present his paper. However, his colleague and friend Muhammad Sadiq Rasuli, a PhD student in computer science at Columbia University, will thankfully present on his behalf, and I know that Muhammad is watching right now because I just got an email from him. So I hope that it looks good to you. And the talk is entitled Automatic Proper Names Extraction from Old Islamic Literature.
Okay, hi everyone. As Elias mentioned, I'm Mohammed. I'm a PhD student in Natural Language Processing Group in Columbia University, part of the Department of Computer Science. And I'm going to talk about automatic extraction of named entities from Old Islamic literature. Again, as Elias mentioned, this is not my work. This is the work done by these guys. As you may know about politics and stuff like that, it's kind of a hassle to come to the US in the Iranian point of view. So, like, I haven't been in my country for 4 years because of this problem. So, what is the task? The task is a part of natural language processing. It's named entity recognition, which is basically first recognizing named entities, proper names in text, and then classifying them to different categories, including persons, organizations, and locations. To give you an example, in English, we have the green sentence on the top. Blinker left Washington at 4 a.m. to meet John Smith in New York City. And the ideal output of the system would be Blinker as a person, Washington as a location, John Smith as a person, and New York City as a location. But is it that like hard to do? That's really straightforward. Well, it is not. So if it was straightforward, there wouldn't be any kind of natural language processing group in Columbia or in MIT or stuff like that. That's the reason for that. So we're still getting funding for this kind of projects. Why? So Washington, for example, first of all, Blinker. Is it a blinker or a person blinker? Or is it George Washington or Washington, D.C.? Maybe Washington State, who knows? Is it John Smith, the organization, or the person? And if you're kind of picky, you can think of New York, like there's a city after New York, but if there wasn't a city, maybe the person forgot to say New York Times. Is it important? Yes. I don't know how many times you felt that Google search is stupid. I don't want to blame Google, but this is kind of an indicator that named entities are really important for information extraction. So when did Steve Jobs die? If you know that the Steve Jobs was a person and it's searched in Google, so it should be a famous person, it's easier for you to look up in Wikipedia or other common data sources. So why is it important for us? For my colleagues. You know, there are a bunch of narrations from prophets, companions, and some historians in the Islamic literature. And if you know that which people narrated about what part of the kind of Islamic history, you can first validate the hadith or narration. You know, there are a bunch of wrong narrations that people think that is true. Let me give you an example. Like from my childhood, I learned that the Prophet said, "Utlubul ilm min al-mahdi lil-lahd." But I realized that there's not enough documentation for that, which means that study from the very beginning up to your death, and it's a kind of recommendation by the Prophet, but there's not enough documentation for that hadith. Also, the value of that hadith, if you know that the person who narrated the hadith is a direct companion of the Prophet, for example, the Khulafa, it can be more important for you to study that. And also, on the other hand, there are like a bunch of volumes of books here and there for Islamic literature in the Sunni school, in the Shia school, and maybe some scholars need to cluster them. So you can think of clustering hadith based on the narrators. But there are certain types of problems in old Arabic text. The first problem is not really kind of specific to Arabic, which is the ambiguity in the meanings, but you can think of it as a challenge. Like in the example here, you have Farid, which can be a person name, a male name, or alone, an adjective. Or you can have Jamila as a female name, or beautiful. You can have Karim as a male name, or merciful. So here in this example, you have Qala Karim means Karim said, the person said, but you can also have Qala Karim, a man who is merciful said. So it is not that straightforward. The other thing is that if you notice from the example that I showed, all those words were capitalized in English, like Washington, New York City, and stuff like that. But there is no capitalization in Arabic script. So here, if you translate this text, you can see, so Solomon is capitalized, Hassan ibn Ali is capitalized, Kufa is capitalized. I think mosque shouldn't be capitalized, I'm not sure. Anyways, but in the Arabic part of it, you don't see any capitalization. So that's part of the challenge. And that's why if you run a very kind of naive named entity recognizer on English, you can get like up to 80% accuracy, but that's not true for Arabic at all. And the other problem is, as mentioned in the morning talks, was the lack of diacritics in Arabic. So there are some vowels in Arabic script that people, are lazy enough to ignore them, and just they say, we should rely on our audience that they can understand it from the context. It's their responsibility, not our responsibility. So you can have the 3 letters with different spellings based on how you put diacritics on them, and you can get completely different meanings. Like Hassan can be Iranian president name, Rouhani, Hassan Rouhani, or it can be Husn means goodness, or it can be Hassan, which I think, if I'm not mistaken, which means what an excellent thing. Like, so it is hard. I promise. The other thing is morphology in Arabic. I guess most of you guys are familiar with morphology. In the traditional morphology, like in English morphology, you can attach a prefix, have some lemma or stem, and a suffix, and create words like pre-ordering, that is pre plus order plus ing. But in Arabic, it's more challenging, since in Arabic you can have templates, you can put 3 characters of letter, like as a lemma, and just play with it and create different words out of it. And also the broken plurals and irregularities, which are common in Arabic. For example, here we can have فَسَتَعْلَمُونَهَا, which means then you will know it. So the word fa means then, sa means will, ha means it, and ta'lamun itself is a templatic word. So it was created from alim, which means knowing something. So you put these kind of letters in the template and create a word. So you can have, then you will know it as this, and the whole thing is just one word on the surface level. There are other challenges. The main challenge is that most of the annotated texts for machine learning purposes are written in modern standard Arabic, the Arabic that is used in newspapers, that we will show that it's not really similar in context and also in genre. So modern standard Arabic is like, you can use modern standard Arabic for political speech, but I don't think any person uses kind of classical Arabic in nowadays. So our proposed approach is kind of clustered into 7 steps. We first prepare data, we do word segmentation, then we recognize word categories or parse speech tags that we write it as POS tagging. Then we find phrase boundaries, which is BPC, means base phrase chunks. Then we tag each word using some gazetteer, some kind of big gazetteer of named entities from Islamic texts. We train a machine learner on it, and then we evaluate the model. So this evaluation is not part of the model, it's just kind of as a principled way of doing some research. So first, the data collection part. Our colleagues did some really nice work on collecting some sentences from Al-Irshad. I think it's by Sheikh Mufid. It's a Shia scholar, and they just manually annotated named entities in it. So it has about 2,000 sentences with about 200,000 words. And comparing to a modern standard corpus, you see that, although the modern standard corpus has more sentences, it has less words. So the old Islamic text is longer because it says the first companion narrated from the second companion, narrated from the third companion, narrated from the 100th companion that the Prophet said. Now the sentence is started and something. But modern standard Arabic is not like this. And about the distribution of named entities, you see that in the blue bars, which are the Islamic Arabic, you see more persons as named entities in the corpus compared to the standard Arabic, where you see lots of organizations, where just 10% of the data in the Islamic literature is organizational. I think it should be some courts or I don't know if other than courts there was any organization, or maybe the government itself. And also 17% of Islamic words in Islamic literature are named entities, while in modern standard Arabic just 10% of them are named entities. So after that, we did word segmentation. Concretely speaking, you see Jalasa Suleiman Ghalila, and you see this Fakharaj, this part, that is segmented to 2 words because this fa means done, so it is basically 2 words. So by doing that, we increased number of words from 220,000 words to 260,000 words. And this can help us reducing morphological complexity of Arabic. In the next step, we did part speech tagging, which is basically assigning a word category to each word. So jalasa is a verb, thumma is a conjugation, and kharaja is a verb. And this, like by clustering words into syntactic categories, you can kind of hope for the reduction of meaning ambiguity. So these are all automatic, by the way. Then we did phrase chunking. So we see, for example, Ali is part of a prepositional phrase because it starts with Ella, which is to, and Jalasa is part of a verb phrase, and so on. And then we use a gazetteer, which is it contains 18,000 person names from many Islamic books, and we assign for each word we assign a true or false indicator whether it is mentioned in the gazetteer or not. For example, here Hassan ibn Ali is mentioned, but Suleiman is not mentioned in the gazetteer. So when something is not mentioned, it doesn't mean that it's not a named entity. And finally, except the English row, the machine learner looks at the data like this: some words, some part speech tags, some phrase assignments, and some true and false indicators of whether they are at least assigned as a named entity once in some Islamic text. So the whole process is that we pick this data set. For evaluation purposes, we hold out 20% of the data as a test set, and we don't touch it during training. And we extract patterns of person names with some machine learning algorithm. Specifically, it's AdaBoost, but it can be any machine learning method. It doesn't have to be a specific machine learning method. And in order to evaluate the usefulness of our corpus, we also try to train a model on modern standard Arabic and apply it to the Islamic literature. And also, we try to learn a model without gazetteer to see if that gazetteer helps at all or not. And we apply the 3 models on test sets to see how much improvement we can get by these kind of data enrichment steps. So here's the awful results from training on modern standard Arabic applied to Islamic text. There is no Obamaized Islamic text, of course. There wasn't any United States in Islamic text because it wasn't discovered that time. So 26% in NLP is like a joke. Nobody relies on 26%. Then we used the Irshad corpus, but without gazetteers, and we see a very huge increase in accuracy. It's 80%. And when we use gazetteers, we see a kind of amazing increase in accuracy. It's kind of very close to 100% accuracy. So basically, we can extract named entities with 95% accuracy. So first of all, let me conclude. As a conclusion, I think this is a little bit challenging. There are some other ways to improve our task. For example, the data set was only specific to one specific book because of budget issues and stuff like that. But I think, I mean, I'm kind of as a person who is judging this work, think this is a great work, but it's a premiere, so should be more work on it to really see if we can do with that accuracy on named entities and also the downstream applications of it. Thank you.
Hey, Maxim, we're going to be putting you in 1 sec.
Right, let's switch that over. Thank you very much. And thanks to Muhammad, who I think is watching.
Hi, Maxim.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Oh, great.
Actually, that microphone's on now, too.
Okay, great. So hold on 1 sec. Okay, Maxime, are you there?
Yes, I'm
Okay,
here.
great. Well, given the reverential way that we have been speaking about Maxime today, I think it's only fitting that he comes at us like the voice of God descending upon us. Maxime Romanoff really wanted to be here, but as I mentioned, there were some postal problems. And so I will introduce him. Maxime is a research fellow at the Alexander von Humboldt Lehrstuhl for Digital Humanities, University of Leipzig, and a frequent participant in our programs here at the Digital Islamic Humanities Project. He needs no introduction to most of you, but if you have not heard of his work, do keep a lookout for the aforementioned volume from De Gruyter. His paper in that is called Abstract Models, Towards Abstract Models for Islamic History. It's a wonderful essay. So keep an eye out for that in January. And his paper today is entitled Dhahabi's Monster, Dissecting a 50-volume Arabic Chronicle cum Biographical Collection from the 14th Century. Okay, I turn it over to you, Maxime.
Okay, thank you so much. It's really great to be in Providence, however, virtually and remotely. So I'll just jump in because I've got quite a few things to cover, and we'll just jump in. So I'll talk about Tarikh al-Islam, which is a huge dictionary, huge book put together by Dhahabi in the 14th century. It's 50 volumes, covers 7 centuries, includes about 30,000 biographies and over 3 million words. So it's a lot of data for modeling historical processes. And this is where we have a big sort of a question mark. So we can do a lot of interesting things like modeling the prominence of urban centers over time. We can try to see how different regions of the Islamic world were connected with each other, and how that was changing over time. We can look into how different regions of the Islamic world were integrated into the core and how they were connected with each other in general. And as you can see from these two graphs, a rare Andalusian would make it as far as Khorasan and the other way around. We can trace the long-term patterns. Like, for example, we see here that clearly the Islamic community started as tribal, no secret for anyone, but by the end of the 3rd century, Hijri century, it clearly stops being as such. So, and the role of military commanders or military class in the elites, and so on and so on. we can trace how what our authors were talking about, and here the graph shows how the interest, the focus on caliphs, sultans, and emirs was changing over time in the discussions in the texts. So the big question: can we actually use a Dhahabi like that? When I first presented my work, I got quite a few outrageous no's. The Tariq al-Islam is al-Dhahabi's vision of Islamic history from the 13th century. So everything is not what it is, what I naively think it is. Well, the big question is essentially who is right. Again, we have a 50-volume book that's over 3 million words, 30,000 biographies. You know, to what extent one can be consistent in terms of implementing whatever agenda he may have, and in many ways, it's none of us objectively had a solid answer whether we can use this information like that or we can't, because it's simply too much data to evaluate it. So Tariq al-Islam is characterized by pretty much everybody who ever talks about that as a compilation of early sources. But here's a big question: what exactly is a compilation? The big question: how in the world does one write a 50-volume book without a copy-paste function in the 14th century? So, that's it's a methodological question in many ways, because if we understand how that's happening, we can it affects how we deal with that information. So the question is that did he paraphrase his sources and thus changing their language and bringing 13th century into the description of early periods, or he stitched the Tariq al-Islam from his sources, thus preserving the language of early sources? So at that time, I didn't have an answer to that question. I only had certain hunches, but they were often kind of felt a little bit circular to build any solid argument on that. But now I have a way to actually address that, and the way to address it is the text-to-use methods that allow to trace long quotations, paraphrases, and allusions between texts. And here's an example of one of these results. And as you can see, it's basically the same text. We have in one is Ta'alim Thimar al-Qulub fi al-Mudaf al-Mansub, and another one is one of his sources. And you can see there's very slight differences, but overall the text is the same, except for sultans for some reason becomes shaitan in another text, but that's not surprising, right? So, but as you can see here, you see this sort of this kind of empty spots here, and so the algorithm that we've been playing around with allowed to trace this text to use, even though the text is not reproduced exactly. There are some variations in it. So what follows is a part of a collaborative effort, which is called Kitab Project between Aga Khan University and the PI is there, University of Leipzig, Tufts University of Northeastern, and Göttingen Center for Digital Humanities. So this is our team with Sarah Savant as a PI, principal investigate, and several technical experts from Aga Khan network volunteers. These are our partners. Gregory Crane, who is together with Elias, is patron saint of digital Islamic humanities, and two programmers who developed this algorithm for tracing text to use. And in particular, I'll talk the work that will follow is based on David Smith's work. His code is called Passing, and it's been used and became actually quite known through this viral text project which traces texture use in 19th century American newspapers. So, few more technical introductions. So, the graphs that will follow are built in the following manner. So, how do we trace this texture use? First, we take all the sources, we split them into chunks of 100 words, and then we compare every chunk with all the chunks in the corpus. And let's say, so you see the graph here. I don't know whether you can see my laser pointer.
Yes, we can.
Okay, good. So, for example, we identify a chunk number 5,000. We identify the match of 80 words. We graph it like this. Chunk 1,000. We identified 60 words. We graph it like that. 15,000, almost 100 words. We graph it like that. So that's a graphic method of sort of visualizing this texture use that we discovered. For convenience, we can also divide Tarikh al-Islam into, what we have here is that 0 is or number 1 chunk is the very beginning of the book, 30,000 is the very end of the book. I hope it's more or less clear. So, and we can then divide sort of sections of Tarikh al-Islam into showing what periods he's talking about. So this is the 7th century, here, the last one, 6th century, 5th century, and so on. If we graph texture use, we compare Tarikh al-Islam with itself, we'll get something like this, just one big black blob. So I just want to show a few results from this graphing. So to show you the amount of texture use that we could identify in Tarikh al-Islam. So Sira Nabawiyya, we have the equivalent of 94 pages taken from Sira Nabawiyya of Ibn Hisham. Tabaqat al-Kubra of Ibn Sa'd, 123 pages. And that's roughly, if we count the pages, something like 300 words. Tarikh of Khalifa ibn Khayyat, 25 pages. Musnad Ahmad ibn Hanbal, 117 pages. Tarikh al-Tabari, 124. Tajarib al-Umma of Miskawayh, about 30 pages. Yatimat al-Dahar of the Alibi, about 10 pages, but Hilat al-Awliya is about over 100. Dalail al-Nubuwa, we have about 371 pages of text borrowed from that and used in Tarikh al-Islam. And what's interesting, you can see how it appears exactly where we would expect it to be, right? In the part where that's a prophetic period before Hijrah, so before the Medinan period. A huge amount of text taken from Tarikh Baghdad, Tabaqat al-Hanabila, Tarikh Dimashq, Ibn Asakir, over 800 pages. So, Andalusian sources, interestingly, you can see how it's Sila, Kitab al-Sila of Ibn Bashkuwal also appears quite significantly, about 52 pages. Muntadam of Ibn al-Jawzi, and so on and so on. So the scale of texture use that we can identify with this is that if we say Tarikh al-Islam is about 11,000 pages, 15 major sources of this book amounts to over 3,000 pages. So you can see some results here. Another issue that I wanted to talk briefly about is how his history is related to his other works. And if we look at his Siyar al-A'lam an-Nubala, we can identify about 30 to 35% of text from Tarikh al-Islam in Siyar al-A'lam an-Nubala. And again, 50% of misidentified passages are between 26 and 66 words long. So these are not coincidences. These are clearly quotations. Tazkirat al-Huffaz has something between 25 and 26%. Ma'rifat al-Qurra al-Kibar, about 22, 24% from Tariq al-Islam. So, and that kind of leads me to the idea is that he wrote his Tariq al-Islam as a data bank for his other books. And he compiled those books using Tariq al-Islam. And it would be interesting to see if we can experimentally generate his smaller collections and see if we can recreate them, and in that way we can have a sort of a more solid results about how he was working as a historian. So the first part was clearly showing that he was stitching together his book from other sources, and most likely been using a similar method to write his other works. So the last section that I would like to talk about is, I think what I showed right now looks like he wasn't really an original historian. He was just kind of collecting data, hashing it, rehashing it, and what's his contribution? Where's his analysis? Tariq al-Islam kind of lacks it. I mean, you find his comments in each section very often, but the book doesn't really have a conclusion or anything that would offer a perspective on the data that he collected. So I quite accidentally sort of came across this Al-Amsar al-Dawat al-Athar, which is the exact opposite of Tariq al-Islam. The book is just it's just a 4-folio epistle with a focus on cities and provinces. So while in Tariq al-Islam he talks about people, here he lists about 80 cities and provinces and gives a very short characterization of the role of that place in the history of hadith learning, essentially. So and when I looked at this epistle, what struck me the most is that it looks a lot like his statements about those places are very similar to the graphs that I've built from Tariq al-Islam. So that's just a sort of a map of coverage of Tariq al-Islam. So interestingly, he speaks about these places, about 80 places in different manner. So for some of them, he has a very solid, very specific statements. For others, he has a very vague statements, and in the third case, he just mentions the places. And when I looked at what he has in Tariq al-Islam for these places, what appears is that whenever he has a very solid, very specific statement in Al-Amsar, in Tariq al-Islam, he has a lot of data. He has a lot of data about that place. So, for example, these are the graphs for Medina, Basra, and Kufa. Well, essentially, we're graphing here Al-Madani, Al-Basri, and Kufi. And in Al-Amsar, he says that these are the earliest centers of Islamic learning, but by the end of the 3rd century, in the course of the 3rd century, Islamic century, they practically disappeared. That's exactly what we see in the graphs. When we look at sort of middle intermediate centers, his statements are very consistent with the graphs that we get here about Baghdad, about Nishapur, about Andalusia. But these statements are usually he says that, okay, the place was founded or conquered this period and then was destroyed or conquered by somebody else that put the end to the place. What's interesting, however, is his statements about the late centuries and Damascus, for example, he says that it's never really been a big center until the beginning of the 6th century and the coming of strong local dynasties. Even more so, when he talks about Egypt, he says that it was on the rise until the coming of the Fatimids, and then the fate of learning in that region went down, and that's exactly what we see here. And it starts recovering with the reconquest of Egypt by Salah ad-Din. So overall, it seems like it may be that his statements in Al-Amsar are just based on the general flow of Islamic history. But at the very end, he talks about the fate of Islamic sciences in general. And he says that it is said, but the prime time of Hadith sciences is over, and it's now in decline. And that's actually exactly what we see in the graphs if we graph people involved in Hadith learning and in Hadith transmission. And now it's the time of Islamic law, and that's exactly what we see from the graph of specialists involved in fiqh. So that's I guess that's all I wanted to say.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry.
Fantastic. Maxime, this is the first time you have ever finished before your time was up. So I think from now on, this is how you should give talks.
Please don't do that to me again, because it's so weird to talk to a screen.
Okay, well, so maybe we can have our panelists who are not in Germany join us up here, and then we have about, let's see, we have about 40 minutes before the coffee break. So if anybody has a question for Maxime, just raise your hand and I'll hand you the mic. Otherwise, yeah.
Hi, Maxime. This is Jonathan.
Yes.
Thanks for the great talk. I think I'm wondering, and maybe other people also are wondering, how to do the same thing. So can you explain what's the status of the tools and the corpora and how we can use them for our own research, if we can? And also, what are specific challenges that you had or are having? Thanks.
Wow. Okay, that's a lot of questions. That's enough questions for the entire talk. So in terms of corpus or corpora, you guys have access to all the 3 big collections that I've managed to collect, to put together. As you well know, metadata is not very consistent. We have a lot of overlaps between, so we have about over 10,000 texts, but they're the same text in different collections, so it makes it rather difficult to scale up the kind of research that I'm trying to do. As to the tools, this PASSIM tool is it's available. It's on GitHub, I think that David Smith will be quite happy if other people are using it for some things that he didn't anticipate. But with regard to challenges, well, we need to have this text in some kind of more logical format. What we have right now is essentially just TXT files with no structure, with nothing in there. So that's why Alex was suffering trying to remove those introductions from the texts. So I mean that's a big challenge. So there are way too many of them. I don't even know where to begin and where to end.
Anybody else? If you have a question that's not for Maxime, just shout it out.
Maxime is in big demand.
Hi, Maxime, this is Peter.
I can see you.
Okay.
We can't see you.
Yeah, I was just wondering about the text reuse. How did you also try which of the, for example, if you get the result that Dahabi quotes Ibn Sa'd, did you also check if the secondary sources may be also quoting the same person? So because so I don't know if you understand the question. It's not really well put, but so I just mean, like, do you have like a possibility that the same quote turns up 5 times in your graphs, for example?
I think so. I think so, because actually these sort of graphs of identified text use don't necessarily mean that he took text directly from that particular source. It could have been something in between, very easily, of course. That's the next step that I'm planning to work on is sort of a network of connections between that visualizes the network of text reuse between those texts. And of course, there may be the actual sources may be not in our corpus. Again, what we have is very heavily biased, so it's rather I don't know. My estimates, it's at best 5% of what could have been written. If we just compare with the bibliographical collection of Hadith al-Arifin, which has 48,000 titles listed. So yeah, there's definitely that. So my kind of 3,000 pages, that's a little bit of an overstatement, but just to make a point.
Hi, Maxime, it's Alex. First of all, another awesome talk and just really amazing stuff. But you teased us a little bit, me on, when you said, well, do they exactly quote, or do they tend to adapt the language into the more modern language? So what have you seen? What have you found on that?
Well, I mean, what I've been trying to see is to find is that can we identify these long quotations? So if we have these long quotations, clearly he just takes this stuff and then just copies it verbatim, which makes a lot of sense. If you want to write a 50-volume book, you probably don't want to paraphrase too much. It will take forever. And Tarikh al-Islam wasn't the only book that he wrote. So, but of course, there's a lot of now with this sort of a distance done. I need to go into close reading and look at the results more specifically and see how it differs from, let's say, from author to author, from collection to collection.
Thank you.
Question for Muhammad about the Nur corpus. Does that refer to just the Irshad, like the corpus that was based on the close reading of the Irshad and the name recognition, or is that a reference to the Nur library corpus? This is also a question that Maxime had over Twitter.
Yeah, it's complicated. Nur is the company, as you may know.
Yeah.
So I think the main reason for that name is that these projects tended to be continuing. So, like the first author mentioned briefly that he wants to extend this work to other kind of like Bahar, for example. This is 120 volumes.
Yeah.
So I think, yeah. So the Nur library is more extensive.
Okay.
So I think it's kind of some portion of it's kind of selectively
Right.
sampled, just to have a kind of representative distribution of the Islamic literature.
Hello, Maxime.
Yes.
Hi, my name is Sam Ross. I'm a PhD student at Yale University, and I'm asking a question on behalf of several of us. We were discussing during lunch, and we were all wondering out loud what the current thinking is on the best OCR program, either for Arabic or Persian well, Arabic OCR or Persian OCR. And I was advised to ask you because you'd be the expert.
Well, I'm hardly the expert, but because I don't really do that myself. But we are currently here trying to go looking into several options, several different ways of doing OCR. We have a PhD student at the Institut für Informatik who is planning to write a PhD on OCR, on Arabic and Persian OCR. So I'm working currently on a training, preparing a training data set so that we could use it and evaluate the precision of OCRing. But unfortunately, we don't have anything working, anything reliable, and my feeling is that nobody does.
Well,
So.
I'll interject. Last year's workshop, we spent the whole first day doing all these different panels, and including, on many occasions, we kind of said, an OCR for Arabic is just not available, it's not available, it's not available. And then at the end of the day, there was a representative from Brill who gave a talk about Brill's humanities projects, and he was the publishing director, and he said, no, we've solved it. So Brill has actually on the cutting edge. They have developed their own proprietary trainer that is getting something like 96%, 97% accuracy, which is good enough for Arabic, but that's laughable. But
Can I add to that?
Yeah.
Guys? So the thing is, yeah, I mean, for modern standard Arabic, it does, you can get pretty decent results. When it comes to classical Arabic, everything is messed up, and Brill, with all this secret program developed and stored in some, somewhere, they still, when it came to Biblioteca Geograforum Arabicorum, they decided to double key it, not to OCR it. So again, if we're talking about classical Arabic, I think we're still a bit far away from the solution. Please tell me that I'm wrong. I'll be happy to hear that I'm wrong.
I think Karen had a question.
Just
Well,
shortly on,
it's a different one.
just shortly on this OCR, I also remember that he said that the 96% was on freshly printed books.
Yeah.
And not most of our books were the end of the 19th century to the early 20th century.
No, it's a difficult problem. I noticed because in my past computer science life, I decided to do an OCR as my project. And I started studying it. That in terms of PhD projects that people were doing at the time, which was 5-6 years ago, they were epsilon tweaks. Nobody was close to anything. And I'm talking about earlier. I'm talking mainly about Persian and Urdu, not Arabic. In Arabic, I believe, is slightly because of Naskh, because Naskh sort of confines itself within a particular line, but Nastali breaks out of it. And that's where OCR runs into a problem, because for English, everything, or for modern sort of, the Latin script, it follows a line, and the sort of, you cannot use the same technology or same methodologies because they divide a line into sections and then read through that line. But as soon as you move into two lines become one, you just run into really complex mathematical problems. So I don't know how close we are. I think it's far.
I have a question for Muhammad. Two questions actually. One, you mentioned that you used photo-speech tagging and base-phase chunking and everything. I'm assuming the tools were developed for modern standard Arabic. So, if so, do you have some notion of how well they work on this classical Arabic kind of texts?
That's a good question that I have no answer for it.
Okay.
Sorry, because...
No, that's fine. And the other question, so the numbers are very good, and especially with the Gazetteer, jumping from 80 to 95. It's so good that I'm actually a little concerned. So what do you think about that? Do you have some explanation how could you reach that good numbers? Compared to it's always dangerous to compare to other languages, but compared to English, even after a lot of work, you don't see that kind of numbers, right?
I think one possible reason can be a bug. Every time you can guess about it. Other than a potential bug, I guess there is a big overlap in narrations in different books. So it's really possible that you pick something from Gazetteer that the same sentence or the same person occurred in that kind of resource, and you're just trying. It's a kind of overtraining, you know.
I want to ask you about the gazetteer. Is it the gazetteer of compound names? So it's like Ahmed ibn.
Yeah.
So yeah, that would probably explain a lot because a lot of the names are in the snap, so
Right.
they would come back in the
Yeah.
same format. Right.
Who's the question?
I have a question for Karen. I love this project, and I was just wondering, I was kind of overwhelmed by all the possibilities of this visual tagging. So what is the hierarchy of criteria that you're using to select maps or texts to compare? So like you compare medieval to contemporary, or otherwise, like how do you pick that hierarchy? And second, is there a way of visually tagging instead of going from image to text, which a lot of times happens, to go from image to image? So perhaps like if you see the Jabal al-Kilal in one map, maybe it pops up in a painting of the same time or in a different context. I mean, is there a way to tag visually instead?
That's Maxime.
Okay.
Maxime is going to probably answer these questions because I probably won't be able to. What do you think, Maxime?
Unfortunately, I couldn't hear it well, so I'm sorry.
Oh, here, you couldn't hear it well. She'll have the mic so then you can hear it well and then we can all respond. Well, I mean, part of the answer I can give you was I was leaving it open to whoever uses it to pick the images that they want to compare. But the question of visually being able to pull up, I mean, I'd like to do that in the long run, especially with the Timurid work and with the parallels and the miniatures. At the time, for the time being, it's just me and my eyes and what I've seen and how I can compare it. But it would be wonderful. Except, I'm already dealing with about 3,000 maps, and if we add into it all the miniature images that we could use, we're looking at a very huge database. It would be wonderful to run it. It would be good to have the visual side along with the linguistic side. I mean, here we're seeing a lot of emphasis on the language, but we need something similar for the images as well. And I don't have the programming background myself to know exactly how this would be done, so that's why I'm saying maybe Maxime might have an idea. Do you have any ideas for visual tagging?
In terms of visual tagging, that we have this project which I'm Recogito, a team of European scholars who are interested in geography who developed a framework for tagging images. Yes, they have that. It's not. I think it's mixed, both automatic and manual. So yeah, that's possible. We can probably do some kind of image recognition, computational comparison as well. But I'm not really working with that, so it's hard really for me to say more specifically about that.
And I should say that I also wanted to talk, I mean, one of the reasons I'm here is also because of Maxime, because we got in touch and we got talking about ways in which we can bring my work on maps and his work on the historical sources together. And we've been exploring that, and we thought maybe we might explore something like that here, but it hasn't quite happened. So maybe down the road we're talking about, because Maxime has done some very interesting work. I've seen it in your earlier program where he's actually projected a contemporary map onto a medieval map and then stretched it to fit the space. So he's done some very interesting manipulations that I think could be very useful as well. And we're talking about ways in which we can merge our work. So.
Maybe I can add that there's a lot of work.
Do you want to have the mic so he can hear you? Because I think anything that you say, if you don't have the mic, he won't hear you.
I just wanted to say that in the recent years, there's been a lot of work on computer vision and object recognition. So I think your data can be very valuable for people working on that kind of algorithms. And since you have a lot of maps that you already have some manual annotation for, then you can train a program to learn how to do that on new maps. That will be like the classical paradigm to do that. And then if there's a bunch of new maps that you haven't had the time or the resource to do that, you can maybe build a program that will do that automatically, learning from your already annotated maps. So teaming with people from the computer vision would be the way to
Computer
go.
vision, interesting. I mean, I have developed my own FileMaker database where I put a lot of material in, including images.
Yes.
So maybe being able to somehow sync that and combine it and mine it as well. I don't know. I don't have enough. I thought a long time ago that I really love doing all of this, but if I were to spend a lot of time figuring out how to do it, I would never get published. And that's one of our issues, isn't it? Is that we're still not, a lot of the digital material isn't necessarily being accepted towards our careers. Right, Maxime?
Yes, unfortunately. And by the way, I think that this computer vision is this is where we may have a much better solution for Arabic OCR. So.
Can you pull it up on your screen, since we can see your screen here? Can you open a tab and that does computer vision?
Oh no, I don't really have anything like ready, so that.
I see. We have to have something ready in order to see how it works.
Yeah.
Okay.
Just, it reminds me of a project back in Iran, like about 6 years ago, that they wanted to create a parallel data. Parallel data means for like sentence by sentence translation for machine translation purposes. So they scraped Gutenberg project novels and they bought every Persian translation for those books. And there was a dude who claimed that his OCR system is like 95% accurate. But it was on character level, not on word level. So they realized that if they hire people to correct the spelling errors, it would be much more expensive than typing everything from scratch. So they typed everything from scratch, and it was much cheaper than.
My gosh.
And the corpus is now like available. So it's, you know, at least 5 years ago, OCR for Persian was not very reliable. Yeah.
No, but I mean, just because you mentioned computer vision, in case like if people wondering what it is, a completely irrelevant example, and actually an ominous one, a bunch of people, like what actual things that computer vision scientists or people are doing. There's a startup in Silicon Valley by some Pakistani kids. What they're doing is now when you see videos on your TV or film or YouTube or whatever, for example, like if somebody's seeing the live feed of this, right, they're seeing that there are these 4 bottles here. But if Coke wants a Coke bottle here, they can just plant it, and everybody who's seeing the video will think that there are Coke bottles here, and they don't actually have to do it. But the vision will, and then automatically advertising, and they've already done it for several TV channels. So I mean, if they can, you know, do it for things like those, I'm sure.
That's how Maxime is actually appearing. He's a computer
vision, you know, just transplant. But I had a question for you, Karen. I was wondering, you briefly talked about in the end of the problems you run in with Google. I'm sure the technical problems are, of course, were there, but I was wondering what kind of ideological sort of questions come up when you're trying to map these, what you call car-to-ideographs, which have a certain imaginary of the world, to as such a sort of a physically neutral world, or the maps that we know it, right? I mean, even here we have the north on top, but you know, if you invert it around, I mean, it's just a certain sort of ideology going on in any case. I was wondering, I mean, other than the technological problems, like what kind of ideological questions do you think emerged out of it in terms of mapping a 13th century imaginary of the Islamic world to what the Islamic world looks like right now?
A lot of very useful information. I mean, like, for instance, just looking at the location of the places gives us a sense of not just the distribution, but the emphases, where the nodes were. And this is one of the reasons why Maxime and I got in touch, you see, because look what he has up here, and what we were wondering is if we could merge the kind of information we have to see how it works, how it sits. So I mean, he's put all this mapping on directly. It comes directly from the text, right? Isn't that how you've got this up here, Maxime?
This
Yeah.
is based on Georgette Cornu's atlas.
Right, right.
So it's kind of some kind of a Frankenstein, another monster.
Yeah, yeah, and
All
we've talked about that, and we've talked about how it has problems, and by projecting it here, we're projecting some of the problems. But I think it has a lot of possibilities. My problem with using Google was for the kind of work that I was trying to do, where I'm trying to have the images, compare the images, have a gallery of the images, having it on a Google page, at least so far what I've tried, has a lot of limitations. I was struggling. So the Flash is still working very well for the display side of the program. But it definitely, there's a lot to be said for putting the map on. And then, as I said, in an earlier iteration of this Digital Islamic Humanities, Maxime projected a contemporary map onto, or what he did actually was he stretched one of these maps to fit onto a contemporary map to show the spatial allocation, so you can actually compare it. I don't know if that helps to answer your question a bit. And Maxime, do you have anything to add to this?
No, not sure at the moment. No.
Did you hear the question?
No, it's very difficult to hear questions. I can hear you very well and Mohammed, but not the question. Sorry.
Do you want to? Yeah.
I was.
Yeah. Can you pass him the mic there? Any questions? I actually said even not to him. You can hear them if you speak into.
Hi, Maxime. This is Taimur. No, the question was not particularly about like, the sort of technological problems that we run in and expect to run in while we're doing some GIS mapping of. But I was wondering what kind of ideological problems or issues or questions come up when you're trying to map what Karen has called a carto-ideograph of an imagined sort of world to something of like what we have in a supposedly neutral map of the world. Which
Wait, there's no such thing as a neutral map.
As I said,
so
supposedly neutral,
Okay.
right? I mean, on Google Maps.
I see. I get. So you wondering. I didn't answer that. The ideological issues involved with putting it on a contemporary map. Yes, you pointed to the directional issues, but that doesn't bother me because we can turn all the contemporary maps that we want around and match them up, so we don't have to fit within the modern paradigm of always seeing a map with north on top. I think it's important for us to turn those things around. Within contemporary maps, we have projection issues, right? Whether you're using the more accurate Peters projection or what kinds of projections. So those could become a factor, ideological factor. That's what you were looking at, right? That's what your question is. What kind of ideological issues one would run into, not just technological issues. So.
Well, I mean, if the question was for me as well, I haven't really been dealing with the working with the images of maps, of medieval Islamic maps. I was kind of more interested in mapping historical processes on the sort of on Earth as we see it now. In many
And do you see any ideological issues with doing that?
No, I don't think so, because again,
He's
I'm
allergic to
starting-
ideology. Okay.
I'm starting from text, right? So if text mentions Baghdad, I want to map Baghdad. If it mentions Dimashq, I want to map Dimashq. I haven't been looking into unmappable entities.
So here's a way to throw something at you, Maxime. We could say, well, by the map we have that you're showing us right now, we've run into some ideological issues there because you have north on top. Why do you have north on top? We should have south on top.
Well, because I want to show my results also to people who know nothing about Islamic history. So if I turn it all upside down, then I lose another half of the audience that
Well,
Yeah.
or we just get them to look, see in other ways, and we force them to do that instead of always complying with their way of seeing. Right, Maxime?
I have no issues with that. I just honestly didn't think about that. So
Maybe one more question? Sam isn't asking yet.
Well, I asked a
Go.
question.
Find it out.
I'll just speak into the mic, even though this is not for Maxime, just for. This question is for Mohammed and Mr. Rasuli. I was wondering if the sort of technique, the second technique you used before you used the gazetteer, where the result went up to 80%, is that something that is expandable to non-Arabic corpus? I mean, you probably you didn't do this project, but I was wondering if you could speak, or if you know of, like, if the same technique could be used to in Persian corpuses like Maulana's sort of huge Masnavi, and if you want to sort of extract names out of it,
You know,
or if it's only specific to Arabic.
there are two kind of topics in machine learning nowadays that is kind of very hot. As you may know, transfer learning and domain adaptation. And you can think of domain adaptation as transfer learning or the other way. So in domain adaptation, like you have the colloquial Persian, the contemporary Persian, and the kind of archaic Persian, per se. And you have some text for both. I mean, the first two guys, but not the last one. So the domain adaptation tends to project the source distribution of like names to the new kind of space where it tends to like have it tends to first cluster entities and understand them in such a way that without having any annotated data for the old Persian, it can understand it, but it's not perfect, as you may notice. So it's more kind of realistic if you just annotate a very small portion of the old text and use the modern text to kind of bootstrap the information from the old text. So just as an example for this task, you know, the word ibn or bin in the old Arabic means son of somebody, and it was used like tons of times. So if you just have like 100 sentences in the old Arabic annotated that this ibn or bin is a very good indicator of named entities, you don't really need more kind of old Islamic text. You can use the standard Arabic to use that. I don't know if I could answer your question.
Well, any more questions?
I'm not sure if 100 sentences is enough to extrapolate on the entire corpus.
Just an example. I don't say exactly 100. I mean, some small number.
So sorry, Mohammed, so the question that I had is that's how you evaluate the precision of named entity recognition, right?
No, I'm
You
not
have-
talking about evaluation. I'm talking about development without any kind of big funding or budget. I'm talking about like you had some nice kind of colleague who annotated some modern language for you, and you wanna have an automatic some knowledge extractor from old language. And what I'm saying is that it is beneficial just to annotate a very small portion of that old language and tend to adapt the new language to the old language with those kind of informative indicators in the old language.
Okay, thanks.
Last question. I don't think this is working, but anyway, I was wondering, looking at Wikipedia as a model where not that much money is put into it, but there's a community of people contributing and sort of writing metadata. Like, is it possible to create a framework where artists, literary specialists, art historians, people like you, cartographers, can kind of write metadata for visual visual, I guess encyclopedias, and then that framework would be able to connect that, and it would keep getting refined and refined as people keep kind of pooling resources. So a different way, so you're not thinking about massive, funding.
Well, one of the problems is that there's the other side of this, which is the major side, which is these images belong to libraries, and although they are centuries old, somehow they still manage to claim a lot of money for us to share them. And some of them have figured out that they can't really claim it in terms of standard copyright. So now they claim it in terms of, well, we'll give you the photograph if you pay us, your firstborn child or something like that. I mean, they can go as far as that. It's pretty excessive. And it depends which library. The Dutch libraries are very generous, for instance, and I love using them. But try go to the British Library and see how much they want for you for one image. And then some other English libraries will fall somewhere in between. The Bodleian will be more generous, but the BNF, oh my gosh, do not put anything of the BNF. Actually, the BNF has an interesting policy now. They don't even wait for you to get permission. Well, you should tell them at the outset, but once you've put it on, then they'll come at you. And then they will tell you what you owe them after you have published it in some venue. And if it's anything bigger than this tiny little postage stamp, it can be very pricey. So that's the big problem, is a lot of these libraries, they survive on the money they charge, and or they think they do anyway. I don't think the British Library survives on these fees, but nor the BNF, but they extract a lot from us. So there's that end of it. That's a very difficult end.
Hi everyone, my name is Queen Bugida. I just joined you here. I'm actually from the library world.
Do you want to give him the microphone so that way Maxime will hear what he's saying? It's okay. You don't have to worry. It's not for us. It's for Maxime.
It's working?
It's working. It's working. Don't worry.
Oh, okay. Actually, the problem is not really making money, because libraries are losing money even by charging you.
Right.
The problem is the publishers and the copyright.
Uh-huh.
There is no way, to go around it, because they will sue the libraries, the publisher, and the copyright owners. That's the main reason.
Who will sue the libraries and
The copyright owners.
But who's the copyright owner of an 11th century manuscript?
The owner is not the 11th century person. It's the person who took the photography. And most of the time, it's what we call an orphan works. We don't know who own it. So by you putting it up, they would say, we're okay, but somehow the owner will show up and say, this is my original photograph.
Oh, so the owner of the photograph, not the owner of
Correct,
the
not
manuscript.
the owner of the thing.
Well, then
yeah.
I should be scot-free since I own most of these images. But I'm not.
But again, libraries are stuck, really. They don't have much choice in terms of, they're not the enemy. The enemy is the copyright laws. And the French one, the BNF, is the most restrictive. The US is in between. And some really make it like orphan works are public domain. I worked in Algeria, Canada, and the US. I worked at the Getty, was a very wealthy organization. And the Getty decided that if they know the owner, or they're going to take the risk because they have means of proving or kind of working around the system of lawyers. This is the reason they were pro-open data, pro-open access. So if the institution, a museum or a library, decide to let it go, and they put high resolution images, but some didn't follow up that trend. And it's working, but it's going to take some time.
Yeah, it is going to take. I mean, it is getting more and more open. There's no question. I mean, when I started doing this, it was very difficult. And now there are so many libraries that have just granted open access. And a lot of European libraries, not the BNF, but other European libraries.
Believe me, I'm into it. Just, let's say, charging you $10. It will cost us $30 to charging you $10. Just the paperwork.
Yeah, I wish they were charging $10. I'd have no problem with it. The issue is when it's like a couple of $100s, you know, per image, or you know, they're very expensive. You try using a super high resolution image from the British Library, and they will take you to the cleaners.
now we
As
have
nice as they are, they will still take you to
And we
the
have
cleaners.
problem with the ebooks now. If we do this, let's say manuscript now online, it's a whole other thing, and it's a nightmare because the rights on the paper is not the same as on the e-side. And when they do this for textbook, for student, they strip the nice images.
They what?
They remove the images in the ebook.
Really?
Yeah, because they don't have the rights to the electronic. They have rights on the paper. So there are different rules per format.
Yeah, I know.
So-
My book is coming out in both
It's a
hard
mess,
copy
it's a
and,
mess.
and
So-
ebook format, and I know that. But what's interesting is, if you have an ebook, the quality of the images are very low because they don't want them to be of a quality that could be copied and distributed. So
It's
they
by
keep
design.
that.
Correct.
That's by design. So we have a lot of issues in terms of, it isn't just the technology to make this possible. It is the opening up of the system to permit this to be possible, where images are released and are available. And there are a few libraries on the cutting edge of this, but not all of them. And so that's a big hurdle. And I think it's probably going to take the rest of the century until they finally decide that maybe they don't really need to hold all these rights to these manuscripts from images from manuscripts from the 11th century. We need a revolution. It's happening. We have a digital revolution.
Aaron Swartz was right here. Aaron Swartz, the guy was charged for systematically for data theft because he developed these. I mean, he downloaded a lot of JSTOR articles systematically.
Yeah, I heard that, right,
He was
yeah.
charged with $1 million and 35 years in prison. He was one of the emerging guys of open source.
Right.
Digital scientist at Harvard.
Yeah, but eventually it's just happening because so many things are coming out there that as much as they try to put all the holes in it, it's getting less and less possible. So that's our future. And the revolution will be televised. Will be webcasted. There you go. The revolution will be webcasted.
We have those wonderful Russian websites you can download.
Oh yes, we do appreciate our Russian friends, right, Maxim? What would we do without them?
Digital humanities. No tenure and you'll probably kill yourself. Okay. with
On that note,
thank you very
let's
much
go for coffee and
talking.
cookies. Thank you, Maxim. Next time we'll see you, we hope.